Hi, everybody. It's Mr. Jones here. I hope that you had an opportunity today to listen to some different podcasts and begin to get an idea of what podcasts are and how they work. If you haven't guessed yet, what you're going to be doing on this next assignment is actually creating your own podcast for this. So, for the assignment today for Tuesday, you're going to find a link to this document in Google Classroom. And you're going to fill out this document as your assignment for Tuesday. So if you look, you see this is the podcast planning guide up at the top. Make sure to put your name in and your class period, whichever it may be. And then as you go through the document, you can see the first step in creating a podcast is to come up with a name for your podcast. So the name could be simple, creative, but you want it to be descriptive of your podcast. So, it could be like, if you want to do a podcast that's about sports, you could be something like, welcome to Basketball Talk with Brad, or it could be maybe about movie reviews, what's in theaters today with Tiffany, or just whatever. It could be simple, or it could just be like, hey, welcome to Tim's podcast, where I talk about whatever I kind of want to talk about that day. So, but you want to come up with a name for your podcast, and then you're going to type the name here. So mine's going to be McConnell's Music Makers. And then number 2, you want to decide on what's going to be the topic of your podcast. So, and this is really up to you. You can make a podcast about whatever you want it to be about. I put some ideas down here, how I spent spring break, the challenges of what it's like having to, do school remotely from home. Maybe other things about, your experience with the coronavirus outbreak. It could be a comparison podcast. Examples that you could do, Xbox versus PS4, or, it could be, greatest of all time, Kobe or Jordan, Curry or LeBron. There's even a podcast out there that's called Who Would Win, where it comes up with all these different ideas of these different fictional characters and that normally wouldn't be together, but if you put them together, who would be better? It could also be a book review, a movie review. It could be a music review. So-and-so's just released a new song, and I'm going to talk about, why the song is really great or why the song is really bad. So you're going to type your podcast topic here. My podcast is going to be how to create a podcast. And then the next one's going to be who is going to be on your podcast. So the easiest thing to do would just to be create a podcast with just you. But if you wanted to include somebody else, like some podcasts are in an interview format where, you talk to someone else and you ask them questions. Or it could be, just something where you're going back and forth. If you're doing a comparison podcast, and you could maybe have 2 people and each person will pick a different side to argue their point of view. So there's different ways to do it. The easiest thing to do would probably just to do one by yourself. But if you wanted to include a friend or a family member, you could do that. And I will include a video on how you would approach that. So, but for this, it's going to be just me. And then number 4, writing a script is an important part of creating a good recording. You don't want to distract the listener with a lot of ums or uhs while you think of something to say. So anytime you listen to a podcast, a professional podcast, they almost always are going to be working off of a script, especially if it's a podcast that is like a fictional story, or like some of them that you may have listened to yesterday. So, but creating a introduction script is important. So I type one down here for you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of McConnell's Music Makers. I am your host, Mr. Jones, and this is the podcast that brings you all the latest news and events from our music technology lab. Thank you so much for tuning in. This episode will be about how to create a podcast. So I typed my introduction here. You're going to type your introduction down here. Then step number 5, the next step is to create an outline of the topics you want to discuss. that you want, or the questions that you want to ask in your podcast. This is going to help you stay on topic, and it'll help you organize your thoughts. So if I were creating an outline for this podcast, my outline would look like this. Number one, I'm going to talk about creating a name for your podcast. Number two, I'm going to decide a topic. Number three, I'm going to think about who's going to be on the podcast. Number four, write my introduction script. 5, create an outline. And then 6, write the script for the end. So you're going to come down here and create an outline or a list of topics that you're going to discuss for your podcast. I would think, on my example up here, I've got 6 different ones. For your outline, you probably want to have anywhere between 4 to 6. You may go more than 6, but be careful that you don't get too many because you don't want your podcast to be too long. And then the last step here, finally, write a script for the end of your podcast. The end should signal, this should signal the end of the podcast. You're going to thank any guests for being a part of the podcast. Thank your listeners for tuning in. Invite them to tune in to future episodes and close with a final statement. So I typed my statement here. That brings us to the end of this episode of McConnell's Music Makers. I appreciate all of you for joining me today and listening to the podcast. Be on the lookout for more episodes in the future. Until next time, stay healthy, wash your hands, keep your distance, and keep making music. So you are going to come down here and type your closing script below at the bottom of the page. And once you have that done, you're going to be really, really close to getting ready to record your first podcast. And on Wednesday and Thursday, I'm going to be posting instructions on how you're going to go about doing that. But the first step is that you have to get this completed first. So that brings us to the end of this episode of McConnell's Music Makers. I appreciate all of you for joining me today and listening to the podcast. Be on the lookout for more episodes in the future. Until next time, stay healthy, wash your hands, keep your distance, and keep making music. This has been your host, Mr. Jones.